I'm joined today by Joshua Turner, who's president and founder of America's first secular prison outreach organization called Saved by Reason. And when I heard about Joshua's story, I wanted to get him on the show to talk about it because it is really an incredible story, and it involves everything from drug addiction, crime at a young age, a prison sentence, and ultimately neo-Nazi, anti-science ideology, and so much more. What's the best place to start, Joshua? I think it would be tell us a little bit sort of about the context of your childhood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where it all starts, as it does for everybody. We pick up, a lot of the personalities and traits as we're, growing up as children, and we pick a lot of that up from our parents. And my parents happened to be evangelical Christian. They were extremely fundamentalist. My mother had a very hard upbringing, and she experienced some really, really rough things that I couldn't even imagine going through myself. So when she was 17 years old, she became a Christian, and she was just like full bore. So she ended up becoming a Pentecostal and joined Calvary Chapel, which was a fundamentalist Christian group that I grew up in. And when I say irrational, I do really mean irrational. If anybody's read my blog, I tell a story about my mom and dad sitting my brother and I down when I was 8 years old and my brother was 6. They sat us down and told us that we were going to be facing what is called the mark of the beast. And basically nobody could buy, sell, or trade any kind of food without taking the mark of the beast. And, credit cards are just a sign that's much closer to that type of technology of having a mark or a chip in your arm where you can just scan it. And so my parents literally believed, because it says in Revelation that to buy, sell, or trade food during the end times, that you would need to take this mark. And they believed, because their pastor told them that this was happening very, very soon, like within the next few years. They told me and my brother that we would be held down and tortured in front of my parents so that they would take the mark, but under any circumstances we couldn't take it.
And did you believe this stuff literally as they were telling it to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're gonna believe what your parents tell you at 8 years old, especially when they're calling a very serious family meeting and they're full of tears and they're crying, and you guys are praying all night that that God will just allow a quick death and just a beheading instead of all the torture. And yeah, I absolutely believed it.
And
I remember
how did
for
that?
years being scared.
So that was from a very young age, and
Mhm.
now you talk about the religious fundamentalism of that. Was there also any of the neo-Nazi ideology that you eventually fell into that came from your parents, or was that totally separate?
I would say that the hate was separate. My parents never justified or supported racism. They believe that we're all God's people, but they were extremely right wing. My father listened to Rush Limbaugh. They're anti-liberal. They have lots of intolerance towards the gay community, towards minority communities because of crime. So they didn't hate based on race, but they did have intolerance and right-wing ideology. So that definitely kind of pushed me in the direction towards neo-Nazism, or it at least made that step a lot easier for me because I had already grown up around right-wing voices.
And when you were 14, what happened that pushed you towards the drugs and the crime?
Really, that was just my way, I think, of lashing out and rebelling. Really, yeah. When you're doing things at that age, you don't really know why you're doing them at the time, and so when you grow up, you reflect and you try to realize what was going on in your head at the time. But yeah, I think I was just lashing out and rebelling because things were so strict at home. I was an artist. I loved to draw as a kid, and that was suppressed at home. My parents didn't want me. They didn't like what I drew. I'd draw Ninja Turtles and stuff, and they wanted me to draw Jesus and Moses. And so I was just really sheltered, and I wasn't allowed to grow into the person that I wanted to be. So I think that drugs and just hanging out with the wrong crowd was my way of just lashing out and trying to find out who I was.
And as this continued, you were eventually convicted of carjacking and you end up in the California prison system. And what's that like?
Well, in prison, if you're white, basically your only choices are to run with the Woods or the skinheads. The Woods, there's a huge range of what the Woods are categorized as, but basically they range anywhere from non-affiliated gang members that just stick to their county. They hang out with whatever county they're from, and then it can go all the way up to Aryan Brothers, several white supremacist gangs that aren't necessarily neo-Nazi in their ideology, but just racist, or like the Klan and stuff. They're considered Woods. And then there's the skinheads, and they're a lot more structured. They're united by neo-Nazi ideology. They didn't use drugs, at least they weren't supposed to. Yeah, I hung out. I didn't hang out with actual skinheads in my town because there really wasn't any active skinheads in my town, but I guess you could say me and my friends were posers. We'd watch, American History X, and we wore our Doc Marten boots and got online and learned what the 14 words were, but we weren't actual skinheads. We were just kind of posers. So when I got into the environment where there was real skinheads that were indoctrinated with neo-Nazi ideology, I had an opportunity to learn from them. So that's what I did. I just felt more comfortable with those guys. A lot of them were Christians. There's a movement called Christian identity and Neo-Nazism. So yeah, I went with that, man. It just felt right to me.
Yeah, and so what was appealing about it? I mean, so you mentioned some familiarity with a little bit of the ideology, the sort of interplay with the Christian upbringing that you had. Was that it, or was there something else that made that the most appealing path in prison?
Yeah, I mean, it was comforting because it just felt so familiar. I was used to going to church with all kinds of pageantry and symbology and songs, and that's what the skinheads had. You know what I mean? We'd have our Nazi flags up, and it was just really similar. Hanging on the word of the pastor. Now instead of doing that out on the street as a Christian, now I was hanging on every word of our skinhead leader, and yeah, the psychology behind it is very similar. As a Christian, we're told, that we're not supposed to hate anybody. We're supposed to love and all that. But at the same time, Christians are still intolerant. It's the same thing with skinheads. They'll try to tell you, we're not about hate. We're about loving our race. But at the same time, they're intolerant of other people. So, yeah, I mean, it was just very similar in all kinds of ways.
And while you were in prison, as part of this skinhead gang that you were running with, did you have to go through any sort of initiation? Did you have to commit violent acts in order to sort of prove yourself? Tell us about that.
No, when I got there, I had my head shaved and I knew the 14 words. I knew a little bit about, what a skinhead was. So I just kind of just fell right in, and nobody really questioned whether I had been initiated or not on the street. But no, I never really was initiated. I just started calling myself a skinhead, and had they checked, they would have found out that I was not really involved with any neo-Nazi movement or anything. I was just an independent skinhead.
So you eventually get out of prison, and at this point, what happens with regards to the drugs and the criminality? Does that continue? And then what happens as far as this skinhead identity that you've taken on?
Yeah, so I got out, and what my goal to do was to be the best neo-Nazi that you could be. So, Christianity, we have a Bible, or they have a Bible to follow, and the skinheads have the 14 words and the 88 precepts. So I studied the 88 precepts well. Not doing drugs was in the precepts. So yeah, I attempted to be a good neo-Nazi, but as I had told you before, I started using drugs at 14 years old, and even in prison, I was using behind their back without their knowledge. So quitting drugs was extremely hard for me, and so I really started looking for ways to get help for my drug addiction. I started to kind of move away from the whole Christianity thing. I've always had doubts about Christianity and kind of leaned towards atheism, even when I was in prison and doing the Christian identity thing, I always had doubts. So I ended up picking up The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and that's basically the turning point for me. That's when I learned that I wasn't applying critical thinking to my life. And yeah.
So I want to remind everybody that we've been speaking with Joshua Turner, who is president and founder of the secular prison outreach organization, Saved by Reason. We'll take a break and then we'll have our full interview with Joshua up on our YouTube channel. So Joshua, as you started to, I'm actually curious, how did you end up, did you go and look for that Richard Dawkins book? Did someone suggest it to you? What were the circumstances of just picking that up?
Oh. Well, my search for truth really has been a long journey. I've read a lot of philosophy. I've read a lot of theology. I've always been trying to find out the big answers that everybody asks. You know, where we come from, why are we here? And I was reading a lot of philosophy at the time, and just the one area of philosophy that I had never really got into was secularism and materialism. And I think it was a friend of mine who recommended the God Delusion. So yeah, I just picked up the God Delusion, and bam, it was just a domino effect from there, man. Then I got Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Peter Boghossian, and just started going from there. And I really got swept up by the new atheist movement. And the only difference here is that I'm not a follower. I'm not a follower hanging on the words of Richard Dawkins. I see him as just a regular person. He's just written a lot of things that have helped me, and I've applied those things to my life. But he's not like a savior to me, or somebody that I put on a pedestal or anything like that.
And as you started getting into these readings and moving in a different direction with regard to your religion, what was going on with the relationship with your parents, who, as you mentioned, hardline Christians, Pentecostal, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, didn't go well. I wasn't quiet about what I was learning. I truly believe that secular values and just having an open mind and being skeptical is just a great way to live your life, honestly. And I just wanted to share that with my parents. So I started to talk to them about what I was reading, and it just honestly didn't turn out well. They're very closed-minded and not open to hearing anybody else's side or anything like that, even though it's coming from their son, who they can see firsthand is changing their life and totally turning their life around for the first time.
Were they able to, I'm curious whether they were able to sort of, because as you started reading this type of material, not only were you changing how you were thinking about the world, but you were also changing your actions, right, with regard to being a neo-Nazi and being involved with crime, etc. Were they able to recognize that even if it wasn't that they believed literally what it was that you were reading about, that it was at least correlating with a positive change in your life?
I don't even think they're willing to admit that. I think that they are equating my success with their prayers. I tell them all the time that my wife and I experience blessings every day, and neither one of us utters a single prayer to any deity. So, and their response is always, "Well, we pray for you." So, yeah, no, didn't.
Let's talk a little bit about the prison outreach part of this, because we've talked to so many different people, both academics and people who have been in prison, and there is this very strong tendency to find religion in prison, and then we see that sort of perpetuated throughout the lives of individuals once they come out of prison. Why does that seem to happen? Is it the circumstances of being in prison and religion sort of seems to be like the natural thing for people to go to? Is there something else that seems to drive people when they're in that circumstance to look to religion?
Really, it's just a comfort blanket. When you're in prison, you are utterly alone. You're sitting in a cell by yourself for 23 hours a lot of the time. And so it's really lonely. And yeah, it's really a comfort blanket. A lot of people that go to prison haven't had a lot of higher education, myself included. So we don't have much to go on when we're sitting in there by ourselves, and it's just very, um, just I can't even think of the word, but yeah, it's just
It
it's
sort of
scary.
comes naturally in a sense that this is the way people go. It just feels like the
Right.
obvious thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, what are you trying to do with Save by Reason? Is the idea obviously the reintegration of former inmates to society is a huge issue that we have.
Yes.
So, what are you doing along those lines? And is the idea to sort of introduce critical thinking skills into that?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what Say by Reason is we're basically a prison outreach organization for non-believers currently in prison. If you are a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist, there's all kinds of information or outreach programs, ministers that will come visit you. But if you identify as non-religious or atheist or whatever kind of epithet you want to use, there's absolutely nothing, no program that I'm aware of. There is Center for Inquiry. They do pen pals and they do send secular books into prisoners, but that's it. And so yeah, so that's where Say by Reason comes in. We're filling that void of reaching out to prisoners that don't identify as religious. And what we do to teach, what we do to use as sort of a, because Christians have a book to go off of, the Bible, and Muslims have the Quran, and everybody has their little book to go off of. And as secularists, it's my job to kind of come up with very simple concepts that will help the inmates lower their recidivism by increasing moral reasoning and critical thinking skills. And one of the techniques that we use to do that is by teaching the Socratic method.
And talk to us about that. So, in what way does teaching the Socratic method, in your mind, help to prepare prisoners for when they're out in the real world to avoid falling into the same patterns?
Right. Well, what the Socratic method does is it teaches you to pause and to reflect on an ideology or a belief or just a definition of something, or just something somebody tells you. What the Socratic method does is it gives you a tool set to analyze that, whatever you've been told, to see if that is indeed correct or if you agree with it. And we find everybody, me, you, even we do this. People just hand down facts to us. People in authority, usually politicians or a boss or a parent, will just tell us something, and we'll just not question it and assume it's correct. And so that's what the Socratic method does. If you apply it, is it helps you to reflect and to self-analyze and self-inquiry into the truth, to see if you agree with yourself, and essentially you're just living your life day to day for yourself, and you're believing and acting in a way that you agree with, and you're not doing things just because somebody told you.
And if people want to learn more about Save by Reason, where's the best place for them to do that?
They can go on our website, saybyreason.org. It's a great
Fantastic.
place. Or they can follow us on Twitter, Say by Reason.
All right, I'll tell everybody once again, we've been speaking with Joshua Turner. He is president and founder of the secular prison outreach organization, Save by Reason. Thanks so much for telling us your story.
Right on. Thanks, David. It's great to be here, man. Appreciate it.